New CBS News polling shows most Americans disapprove of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe versus Wade. 2/3 of women surveyed said they're against the ruling, and more than half believe it will make their lives worse. Approval of the decision is the highest among people who identify as conservatives and evangelical Christians. Joining me now with more, CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. So, Anthony, you found the majority disapproves of the court's overturning of Roe versus Wade. But break down how that might impact the midterms in November.
How you doing, Scott? So let me show you one question that we asked, and it's, does the overturning make you more or less likely to vote in November, or does it make no difference? Now, the thing I want to point out here is the difference between Democrats and Republicans on this, because you see that 50% of Democrats said it made them more likely, and there's a big gap between that and the Republicans who said so. And, you know, there's a couple of theories on this. One is that maybe people are more likely to get motivated for something that they have lost rather than a reward. And, of course, for the conservative movement, a lot of people see this as a big victory. So that could explain the differential. The other part of this is a lot of these folks on the Democratic side are already voters. So it could just be a reaction right now. Say, yes, we're going to be motivated. I think the thing to watch in this is not just one snapshot poll. It's, do people who normally would not vote in midterms say as we go through the fall that they're more activated and they're more motivated? So it really sets up something that we pollsters and other campaign people are going to want to watch and are going to want to track to see if this manifests itself, Scott.
There may be an enthusiasm that was already there before the ruling. Could that manifest itself in these numbers, that perhaps either Democrats or Republicans were already fired up to vote in November?
I think normally in a midterm, you see the opposition party who is already fired up. They've lost the last time, or they think they did, and they want another chance at it. You often have the president's party, the incumbent party, have a harder time revving up its voters. So in the sense that maybe the Democrats use this to try to close that gap, that's the thing we've got to track.
Sure. You also have some new numbers on the January 6th hearings. Are those hearings breaking through in any noticeable way?
Well, let me tell you. Start with this, Scott. Do you think that the president, former President Donald Trump, planned to, and then there's 50% that say they think he tried to stay in office through illegal means? And that exceeds the number who thinks he tried to stay in office through a legal process or didn't plan to stay at all. Now, you and I have talked about this in similar things before. What do you make of that 50%? On one hand, for context, you think, well, in a democracy, the fact that half the country thinks that a sitting president tried that might be something notable. On the other hand, you know, Democrats might say, wait, it's only 50%? And that's frankly because Democrats are paying more attention to these hearings than Republicans are, as one explanation for that. And the other part of this, Scott, is the descriptions of what happened. Well, they still show that Democrats are more likely to call it an insurrection, trying to overthrow the government. But for Republicans, this really hasn't moved. And there's this divide in the party that we'll talk more about, which is half of Republicans call it, and have called it really since it happened, defending freedom or patriotism. So very different interpretations there, Scott.
I'm really struck by that trying to overthrow the government number, the split in party, because the January 6th committee has been pretty unequivocal. That's what they say was happening. It may speak to viewership or the audience they're reaching.
Yeah, and your reporting on this has been so good. It's the fact that this is happening and has happened more in registering among Democrats, much more so than Republicans. You know, we've seen this since the outset. Republicans have been, skeptical of the idea that they need to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. They told us that in the polling. And then now they tell us that they're not paying as much attention to it. So, look, even in a hyper-partisan environment, if you're imagining that there could be some persuasion going on, which frankly we don't see a lot of, you really don't see Republicans paying attention to those points. And these splits in the parties between defending freedom and patriotism among Republicans, they go to larger splits that I think are playing out now in the primaries, where you're seeing a lot of candidates talking about 2020, talking about, you know, what people call the big lie, the grievances that they still have about what might have happened in 2020. Of course, they've been disproven. those candidates many of them are doing well, Scott.
What about the former president's numbers? Are they being affected by all this?
Yeah, let's take a look. A couple of things. One is, if you look at people who vote in the primaries among Republicans, the people who do are more likely than the people who don't vote as often to say that January 6th was about patriotism and about defending freedom. So that's one point. And then the other thing about the former president, one thing we asked Scott is, do you consider yourself part of the MAGA movement? And for those people who vote always in primaries, they're more likely to consider themselves part of the MAGA movement than people who vote infrequently. And so when you talk about the former president's influence, you know, he's endorsed a lot of candidates out there. A lot of candidates are trying to tie themselves to him. And what you see is that even though you see splits in the Republican Party about what happened, you see that the primaries are being more impacted by people who are more on the former president's side, Scott.
Yeah, he doesn't have a 1,000 batting average, but that is sobering for the candidates tomorrow. For example, in Illinois, who do not have his endorsement. Anthony Salvanto, thanks as always.
Thank you.